Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place of conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Well, welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Laurence Davenport. Today we're going to continue our series on the Gospel of Matthew, and the title of that series is Discovering Jesus in Matthew. And I'm here with Dan Weatherall, and we'll be continuing our conversation about this. If you haven't heard the first episode yet, go back and check it out. It's on biblefeed.org. Listen to the first session. But Dan, maybe you can just give us a bit of a précis of what the opening episode was about.
Yeah, hi Laurence. So we chatted about chapter 1, didn't we? First chapter of Matthew, which has that long list of names, which is a
fascinating list of names, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, that exciting start to the New Testament. Which actually, yeah, if you don't know your Old Testament, then it isn't very exciting. But if you do, then there's lots of features in that stand out, that are really, great. So we tried to highlight a bit of that. Things that we tried to show the connection between Jesus and the culture and the people group and the time and the place in which he was born. So he didn't just sort of drop out of heaven, out of nowhere. He wasn't born in a vacuum. He's a real, historical person with roots and a people group with their scriptures. And that's the connection that we tried to sort of bring out.
I suppose they were all waiting for something to happen as well, weren't they? So
sure,
there was an underlying undercurrent of waiting for something to happen. So.
Yeah. They're in a situation. The Jewish people are in a situation where they hadn't had sort of control of their own destiny for a long time, and they were ruled by whoever the dominant power in the region was for a long time. And they were looking for and waiting for some savior to come to sort of take back control.
Yeah. What really stood out for me in the first session, especially that early bit where you talk about that genealogy, was looking into some of the characters that were in that genealogy, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to see.
Yeah.
So we saw, didn't we, Rahab, who was a prostitute. We saw Tamar, which was, a story that, would make your parents blush if it was in any other context.
Yeah.
And then I think you were saying that kind of primes us and gets us ready for what was just about to happen, which is another unusual event in the appearance of Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. And to get people to or get the Jewish readers of the gospel, because bearing in mind it primarily would have been for Jewish Christians, to get them to sort of think back and appreciate that God is working through these these non-Jewish women who were of low status and questionable occupation for some of them, and actually through that though God's purpose is being fulfilled. So in sort of surprising ways. I
think that was kind of like an anti-snobbery type thing, like what they, if there was some snobbery about pure Jewishness, that was being sort of dismissed right early on.
Yeah, I think there's always that tendency, isn't it? It's a human tendency. And definitely is there. You can sort of see that coming through in the Gospels. But remembering or pointing out that in their very scriptures, they've got all these things that undermine that. If there was any sort of nationalistic sort of pride that they had, then actually they should look back at their scriptures. It's kind of undermining that, which is great. That's a powerful lesson in itself, really, isn't it? For us to sort of not go down any kind of nationalistic snobbery line of thinking that starts to sort of demean human beings, really. So yeah.
It's not something that goes away either over time, and we see the same human traits even today. Sure. And Paul the Apostle even had that kind of issue as well, didn't he? So
yeah.
So before we get off onto too much of a tangent there, Dan, let's see what we're going to cover this time. Can you just sort of outline what we're going to look at? What's the structure that you want to bring out for us today?
Yeah, okay. So some of the things I want to talk about today are looking or appreciating that the Gospel of Matthew isn't just sort of haphazardly thrown together. It's not just simply a load of things that happened or a load of traditions or kind of accounts that have been circulating that Matthew's just, the author, whoever it was, has just sort of thrown these together without thinking. I want to demonstrate that there's some real sort of structure to it, really. That's what I think we'll get out.
Yeah, I mean, you think of the gospel record as almost like being a biography of Jesus.
Yeah.
Are you saying it's not as simple as, starting with his birth and just going through the episodes in his life?
Yeah. So it's not. It's very easy, isn't it, to pick up a piece of literature like the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so it's about the man Jesus, and assume that it's kind of just step by step walking through things that happened, and you therefore know exactly what happened to him. But actually, any kind of biography deals with things that are important to the point that they're making. We talked a little bit about this actually in an earlier episode. It was episode 9 about why are there 4 Gospels and the differences between them and things like that, and talked about features of the Gospels that show that they're sort of thematic and things like that. So we're definitely not dealing with something that's video camera footage. It's not. Any historical writing isn't like that at all, ever. It's always, selecting the points that are important to the message that the author is trying to convey. So in this case, the author of this gospel is trying to make some claims about Jesus, who he was and what he did, and therefore what that then means for you, the reader. So all these things are sort of brought together. Now, of course, the man Jesus behind that lived, and these things happened, and they might have happened in a different order, and lots of other things would have happened as well in his life. So we've got that a stylized record of these things, that the way they're woven together is teaching us something about him, which is pretty remarkable, really. So that's what we need to get into.
So you often think, don't you, that John might be the one that's a little bit more, less of a biography and more of a dealing with the themes, just because of the way it begins and some of the things that you see, the signs and things that you see repeated in there. But you're saying that we get that actually in Matthew as well.
Yeah.
So maybe you can have a look at, so you're basically saying that there's some thematic repetition that's going on in this gospel record. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, let's start up. So we're going to build on something from last week, so last episode, whenever it was, which is those Gentile women in the genealogy. So
right.
The Gentile being the term, just to be absolutely clear about that, it's basically anyone who's not Jewish. So non-Jewish heritage, Moabites like Ruth or Canaanites or whatever, English, British, Americans.
It's an interesting word, isn't it? We don't really come across the word Gentile in day-to-day talk these days.
Has any other race got a term that is basically anything else, any other race that is not them other than the Jew?
No.
It's very, it's,
sometimes you have the word barbarian and that, don't you, within some of the versions as well. So
it's curious, isn't it? But so basically that's what it is. So it's a non-Jewish, and I suppose it comes about because of the Jewish people protecting their identity and their heritage and their scriptures, and in that way, it was a major thing, a big deal, that Christianity came on the scene and included Gentiles, non-Jews. So it's a massive thing. Anyway, that's sort of getting ahead of ourselves. What Matthew is trying to portray, I think there's one theme in Matthew, is that there's a close correspondence with the Old Testament. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the son of David, the son of Abraham, all the things in the Old Testament that the Jewish people would be familiar with. But he's also weaving through that all the incidents that show that this is not just for Jewish people. This is for people of all nations. So for example, you've got those 4 women in the genealogy who are critical people in the genealogy.
Yeah.
They, if they, arguably if they weren't there and they hadn't done what they'd done, there wouldn't be this line of that leads forward to Jesus. And then you get the next, so chapter 2, this is something else that happens to, well known, isn't it? It's the wise men, whether or not there's 3 of them, whether or not they were kings, who knows? But it's the wise men of 3 Kings fame.
Why get in the way of a good nativity play, hey?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So whoever these people are, they're from the east, they're from far away. So these are Gentile, these are non-Jewish people. They're the Magi or the Magi. So they're effectively sort of pagan magicians. Which is really, it's very bizarre. This is these people have come from so far away. They've seen a star, whatever that means. And they come to find the one who's born King of the Jews. Okay, and they're the ones that come bearing gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh to Jesus, the one born King of the Jews. And in contrast to that, you have Herod the king, who's the king in the land of Israel, and he asks the chief priests and the scribes of the people of the Jews, where should the king of Israel be born? Where is the king of the Jews? Where's he going to be born? Because he's not here in Jerusalem. I can't find him. And they quote something from Micah, which talks about Bethlehem in Judah. So a small place, just down the road, effectively. And so off go the wise men, these people that have come all this way, and they go and see Jesus and they give him gifts. The people who don't go it's Herod, of course, who feels threatened by this, actually. And then it's the chief priests and the scribes. They've got their scriptures that tell them the king's going to be born in Bethlehem, and yet they don't even bother to go and have a look. So there's a massive contrast being drawn there between these pagan magicians and whatever they, from wherever they were. They're the ones that recognize that Jesus is born King of the Jews, but King of all nations, effectively. It ought to be. That's where it's going to end.
So you're saying it's making a point that those who should have known where to look, when to look, to read the signs were essentially blind to it. But those who you wouldn't necessarily have recognized as doing that, actually coming into the country, following these signs and asking where this king is going to be born. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And they're the ones that give gifts. And, there's passages in the Old Testament that talk about the Messiah as the light who's going to come, and people will see his glory, and kings, actually it does say kings this time, Isaiah 60, this is kings will see the brightness of the glory of this person. And then it lists a whole load of different people groups who will come and give gifts, and it's kind of poetically describing all the different nations coming and giving gifts and basically bowing down to this king, the Messiah. And it includes things like gold and frankincense and in that list. So there's an echo there, that Matthew's deliberately drawing attention to that, I think. And, and this is already happening, although it's, that's something that's going to come a lot later. Jesus is just young at this point, but it's kind of already sort of starting to happen. These magi are coming from far away and bringing these gifts. So it's, so there you go. So you've got right at the start, you've got these women in the genealogy, you've got this incident straight away after the record of the birth. And, and throughout Matthew, you get things like that crop up that emphasize this point. And right at the end, we'll just go right to the end of Matthew, because this is pretty key. So Matthew chapter 28, we've given the end of the story away now.
Yeah. Great. Skip right to the end there.
Spoiler alert. Yeah. So Matthew 28, and this is verse 18 that says Jesus, so this is post-resurrection, this is post everything that's sort of happened before. Jesus, verse 18, says to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." So, that's like, what is it, a summing up, or this is the consequence of everything that's happened. He's now issuing his disciples out to say, go and make disciples, make more disciples, not just of the Jewish people, but of all nations. So you can see that sort of thread through. That's something we'll sort of look at, I think, as we go through it.
So you were talking about the audience of this original, or the original audience of Matthew, and you're saying that, be Jewish, but obviously very early Gentiles would have also immediately been able to recognize this gospel as being for them as well. So this is like this dual application of it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there would have been, I'm sure there would have been Gentiles who would have benefited from, and, Matthew's gospel early on. Of course, many did later on. We're reading it now. We're enjoying it now. Yeah. So yeah, for sure. It's in the time and place out of which it arose, it was almost certainly predominantly to sort of Jewish Christians and those sort of Jewish sympathizers. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It immediately, more or less immediately, the Christian community became multi-ethnic, which is a wonderful thing. So we have that as one theme. Then we have that theme of the Gentile involvement, and the story arc is that then at the end of Matthew we have the propagation of the gospel and the building of disciples from all nations. That's one theme. Are there any other themes that you want to mention?
Yeah, so there's another one which we can go work backwards this time. So we've just looked at the end of Matthew. Jesus says at the end of what we've just read, "Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." So, there's a very deliberate sort of conclusion to this. Jesus is promising to be with his followers. There's that passage right at the start. So right back in chapter 1, I think I might have even mentioned this at the end of the last episode, where we said we need to sort of unpack what this means. Matthew chapter 1 says that when Jesus was born, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel," which means God with us. Okay, so there's this theme of starting off that this is God with us. So there's something happening there. And then right at the end, Jesus says, "I'm with you," once, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. But there's a deliberate, whether or not that's a theme running through the book, but a deliberate sort of bookend that's sort of happening there, isn't it? Right at the start and then right at the end. I think there's, something in that.
Yeah. So the question is, what does that phrase actually mean? God with us, so Immanuel, and then that one right at the end, "I am with you always." Is that like Jesus as God being with us all the time wherever we go? What does that mean? How would you interpret that? So
we've got to you probably come at that. Anyone could come at phrases like that with an awful lot of baggage, I suppose. So we've got to try and read this and hear it like that first century Christian. So we've been trying to consistently think about the connections back to the Jewish scriptures, because that's how this has been written, and how people would have understood and read it. So let's try and do that. What would it mean to a Jewish Christian, or indeed a Gentile Christian who was learning and knowing the Old Testament early on? What would it mean to them that Jesus is being referred to as God with us? That name Immanuel. Well, it's, as Matthew says, it's from a prophet. So it's from Isaiah chapter 7, and that prophecy is an interesting one. It's in the time of King Ahaz, who is a pretty bad king, and he basically doesn't want a sign. So Isaiah chapter 7 is that passage, and it's in verse 11. The Lord said to Ahaz, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven." But Ahaz says, "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel." So there's this passage.
That's the quote, is it? Back in Matthew. That's the quote.
Right. And then it carries on to say, basically, before this boy grows up enough to choose good and, not choose the evil, then the two kings who you're worrying about, there's two kings who are basically enemies of Ahaz, well, they're going to be removed. So you don't have to worry about them. So the sign here is that there's a sign that God is with them, effectively, that God is with the people and will work for them. And so this is, the name given to that person, that child, doesn't mean that he is God. Immanuel in Isaiah is not God sort of incarnate or anything like that. He's a child that's got a name which is symbolic. And symbolic of the fact that God is working with them, and he's going to, get rid of their enemies, basically, in this passage. And the thing is that Ahaz, the king, just doesn't want that sign. He doesn't care about the royal family. He doesn't care about the house of David. He doesn't seem to want God in his life at all. And yet this is, God is with you, whether you like it or not, God is with you. So that's the basis. That's of the original quote from Isaiah. And the Old Testament's full of, different places where it talks about God being with the people. Old Testament prophets sort of talk about, go ahead, you'll win this battle, or we will win this battle because God is with us and God isn't with you, and that sort of thing. And it's it's a claim that basically they've got the help of God on their side, not that anyone is actually God walking around in the middle of them, that kind of thing. So it's quite a common idea in the Old Testament to have God with them. God is sort of working with them.
So in the context then of Jesus saying that, how would we then sort of cast that idea forward into the things that Jesus was saying?
Yeah, all the things that are said about Jesus, first of all. Yeah. So move that forward then. So the people of Israel are in this sort of situation where they are asking the question, is God with them? Is God still with them? They're in this land, but they don't have control over it. They don't have their king installed. They pay taxes to the Romans. They've got, all these things that are substandard, that are not good for them. They've been in exile in Babylon hundreds of years ago, and ever since then, it's never been that great. There's been a revolt where they thought they'd gained back the kingdom, but it all went horribly wrong. Is God with us? Shrug your shoulders. Doesn't really look like it. Maybe God has rejected us, that kind of thing. And maybe a lot of them wanted to be a bit like Ahaz and just sort of point blank refuse any sort of sign that God is with them. I think that actually crops up in the Gospel of Matthew later on. The disciples, they kind of, the Pharisees, they kind of ask for a sign. Come on, prove us that you are who you say you are, Jesus. And they, they're kind of taunting him almost, really. But actually, they don't really want that sign. They don't. They're being a bit like Ahaz. So Jesus, the claim here then Matthew is that Jesus is given this name, Immanuel, because there's this new thing that's happened. This virgin has conceived and bore a son, Mary, and because of that, this is proof. This is symbol. This is a symbol of the fact that God is with us. God, whatever you may have thought of all the things that have been happening to the nation, God is with us, and he's going to work out these things. And it's through this person, this man, that these things are going to happen. It doesn't make Jesus, or it doesn't confirm or deny whether or not Jesus is God or God incarnate or anything like that. It certainly doesn't teach it. There's nothing inherent in that phrase to say that Jesus is therefore, God embodied in the flesh.
I suppose up till that point, they've had like 400 years of almost nothing, no open vision, sort of the not having that sort of express purpose of God and prophets coming and speaking about these things. So, having somebody confirm that to them would be really encouraging, wouldn't it? Sort of at this point when they're in this dire situation with the Romans around them, somebody saying God is with you would be very encouraging to them.
Yeah, definitely. It's what people needed. And, when you read the gospel, it's what many people welcomed and embraced, particularly the poor and the outcasts and the needy, those who were a bit more comfortable in their life, who were either sort of taking what they could from out of the situation, working for the Romans, or indeed those who were trying to sort of fight back against the Romans, like the Pharisees. They were trying to sort of, live their own lives of sort of perfectness. And, the rulers, as is often the case, the ruling class, the higher sort of status people, they're often more comfortable and don't want status quo being disrupted. But those who are in need recognize that there's a great need, and hearing that God is with them is something that they welcomed.
So it's a comfort, a little bit maybe like when David was being chased around by Saul, and he sings those psalms, or those psalms are sung about those situations, and God is his comfort, his tower, his fortress. There's a similar idea there, I suppose. Sure,
yeah, and the psalms are full of God is with us, or God is near, and things like that. So you can
my
read
strong salvation.
Yeah, my rock, and all these things that God is this sort of presence that is with us and will succeed. We'll get through this. This is a terrible time, but God is with us, and that's absolutely. I mean, the more you think about it, the more you see throughout the Old Testament. This is it. This is what it's all about. It's about whether God's with us or not.
Yeah.
And so Matthew's picking up on that and saying, well, this happened. These things happened. These circumstances with Mary happened. She gave birth to a son, and she called his name Jesus. And all this happened because it demonstrates that God is with us. And that's and because Jesus has come, and what Jesus went on to do and teach, and ultimately what happened in his death and resurrection. There you go. I've given the game away completely now, haven't I?
You absolutely ruined the end of this whole story. So I'll stop you there, Dan, before you ruin everything. We've got a couple of themes there, so that's great, and I'm sure you'll expand on those in future episodes. But maybe, are there anything else that we need to consider maybe within the text structure that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so as we go through it, we're gonna notice something, and it's worth just pointing it out now, as in the structure of the book. And it's that there are 5 key points in the Gospel of Matthew where there are sayings of Jesus that have all been sort of collated together. So there's 5 big discourses, effectively, so collections of Jesus' sayings. So this is what I've said before about Matthew has ordered these things. They've probably come from different points in Jesus' life and his teaching at different times, and they've sort of been pulled together. That's fine. That whether, maybe he said these things all in one go, it doesn't really matter. But when you compare them with the other Gospels, these things have been bunched together in Matthew. So you get the chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is that first big section of sayings, when we often call that, you might have heard of it, the Sermon on the Mount. So a lot of Jesus' teaching at the when he was on a mountaintop, and he said lots of these things. Then let me just go to the end of that. So Matthew chapter 7, just because there's a key phrase that this is how you identify these sections. So Matthew 7 and verse 28, after these 3 chapters of sayings, verse 28 says, "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes." Okay, so you get that when Jesus had finished these sayings kind of thing. And then in chapter 10, there's another collection of sayings that are all about sending his disciples out to proclaim the kingdom and what's going to happen, what's the reaction going to be, and are the people going to just love it and receive it, or are they going to be sort of divided and not necessarily accept it? And anyway, at the end of that, so chapter 11 verse 1, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Okay, so there's another sort of ending which is very similar to what we've just seen. And then there's a collection of Jesus' parables in chapter 13. And at the end of that, verse 53, when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue. And there's the narrative then resumes again. For completeness, chapter 18 is a collection of Jesus' sayings to his disciples when they're asking, who's the greatest? Just that kind of humble sort of thing that you ask. Who's the best out of all of us? We shouldn't smirk because it's so easy, isn't it? That's humanity all over. And Jesus teaches them a lot in that chapter 18. Then verse 1 of chapter 19, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee. So there you go, there's another flag. And then the final one is another long one. So chapters 23, 4 and 5, which are all about kind of what's going to happen now. This is building up to the death of Jesus. There's, judgment on the scribes and Pharisees, judgments on the temple and things that are going to happen, and then parables about the future, effectively. And then in chapter 26, verse 1, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, after 2 days, the Passover is coming and I'm going to be killed. You can see just by quickly whipping through that, there's structure, there's order, there's 5 collections of sayings in Matthew, which is really, which tells me that we've got to read it with that eyes open to that. So we've got to work out what the point of that is.
Are you going to talk about that now?
I think there's a lot to it, but a little bit. So if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount and chapter 7, where it ends, and it talks about verse 28, when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So it's the whole message of the way Jesus was teaching is about how that he has the authority. He's sort of teaching with authority. Remember, we had that word right at the end. So Matthew 28 says, all authority, Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. So there's this kind of, it's another theme, effectively. And then what happens? So there's a whole collection of sayings. People recognize he's teaching as if he's got authority. Who is this man? Why is he teaching us like this? And then the collection, then verse chapter 8, there is a whole load of things that now happen. So these are now events, not just sayings of Jesus. And if you sort of skim through them, you realize that they've been pulled together because they're teaching how that Jesus does have authority. So the first thing that happens is a leper, so someone with a terrible skin disease, comes up to Jesus and says, I'd really like to be healed, please. And Jesus says, touched him, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And then Jesus says, well, don't go and tell anyone about this, other than go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. So there's this whole thing in the law where if someone with a terrible skin disease was healed, then they ought to sort of go and show it to a priest to prove that they're clean now, and great, off we go. And Jesus is basically saying, look, you go and show them and prove to them that this healing has happened. This is proving, he's done this. This is a healing. That, it's demonstrating that he's able to do this.
Is that kind of the end of the Sermon on the Mount end of chapter 7, when it talks about him having authority, but the scribes not having authority? Is that and then situations like sending this proof to the priests? Is that essentially saying that these people, these scribes and Pharisees, maybe should have had more authority, should have been able to identify Christ in the Old Testament scriptures? And is that what that's saying, or is it more about that Jesus actually has something special that they didn't have?
Yeah, well, I think it probably is that, isn't it? The last one. Other than the fact it certainly is contrasting the leaders of that generation, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the chief priests. It's contrasting them with Jesus. Matthew's painting the leaders of that generation, the Jewish leaders, in a pretty poor light. So as you go through, it's really, all the things that Jesus said about them in a bad way, they're all here in, far more concentration than some of the other Gospels. It's even to the point that some people have felt that Matthew's Gospel is a little bit anti-Semitic. It's a bit sort of anti-Jewish. And I don't think that's right, because you've got to read it carefully, and it's always against the people in positions of authority or so-called authority. It's against the Jewish rulers and leaders, the ones who are effectively not looking after the poor and the needy and that kind of thing. So it's not against the Jewish race, and
that to a certain extent is not a new message either. I mean, you get the same type of message in Ezekiel about the leaders not doing their job. I think is it in Matthew where it talks about them basically not keeping the keys of the kingdom and not releasing them, and that is then put against Peter and the disciples and them having the keys of the kingdom, the gospel message to go and propagate. Yeah. So it's this like these group of people who are holding this to their chest and not investigating it fully and opening it to people, and this other group of people who are opening it up to everyone.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So it is in Matthew that, and it's that's another sort of major theme, or I suppose it's building on the things we've already thought about. Really, it also talks about the nation, the kingdom will be taken from you. Jesus says to the Jewish leaders, the kingdom will be taken from you and given to a nation who will bear fruit. So there's this whole kind of, you've not done this right, and this is how it should be, and this is a gospel for all nations, for the poor people in our Jewish society, and for and for anyone else who comes and recognizes that I have authority. That's what Jesus is effectively teaching and preaching. And he has authority because he's God is with him, and God is performing these signs with him. That's how this is it. Late. So that's Matthew 8. That's the first thing that happens. This is a proof of Jesus' authority because he can heal this leprous person. And then the next thing that happens is a Roman centurion, of all people, who recognizes that Jesus is a man who's like him. And he says, I'm a man, I'm under authority, and I've also got people under me. So, I'd speak to whoever he speaks to, what sort of Roman
rank.
Yeah. The rank, I don't know, what's over a centurion. I mean, ultimately, there's the emperor, isn't there? Whoever he is.
You're putting me on the spot there, Dan. On my Roman military strictures.
Yeah. So whoever looks after centurions is the one that has authority over him. But then a centurion has a lot of servants and soldiers at his disposal, and so he says to those people, go, and they go, and come, and they come. That's basically what he says. And so the centurion says, I know, Jesus, that you're like that as well, which basically displays that he knows that Jesus is someone under authority. So God is with him, and giving him this sort of authority and power. And also he has the authority to say that let this servant be healed, let this person be healed. And he says it, and the centurion servant is healed. So it's proving that Jesus has the authority. And it's the centurion who recognizes it. Again, not the, it's not the chief priests, it's not the scribes, it's not the Pharisees, it's the Roman occupying force, it's the military. Again, the people who recognize it, which is pretty remarkable. And then it carries on. There's just a couple of other examples. There's Jesus rebuking the storm and the wind and the waves, and the disciples say, what sort of person is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So he's got authority over the powers of nature. And then going into chapter 9, there's this thing about the paralytic man who wants to be healed, and Jesus first of all says, your sins are forgiven. And the people around in the room are sort of horrified. Who's he think he is, saying that your sins can be forgiven? Why does he have the authority to say that? And Jesus says, well, okay, just to prove that I've got authority to say that, to forgive sins, he turns to the paralytic and says, rise up, take up your bed and walk. And so he heals him. So again, he's demonstrating that, yes, he does have authority. So all these teachings that he's given them with commanding authority. And then Matthew then groups all these little events together, these little miracles, healings, all these different things. And that's demonstrating that, he proved that he had authority. Yeah.
And he makes it clear about where the authority comes from as well, doesn't it? Because it's not authority of his own sort of volition, is it? It's the authority given to him by God. Yeah. And it reminds me a little bit of remember when Moses and Aaron had to go into Egypt, and they were given things to say, weren't they, to Pharaoh? It's in a similar way. Jesus had this authority, not of his own purpose, not of his own volition, but from God. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It's a really good portrait. I mean, there's a lot, you just mentioned Moses there. There's a lot in Matthew that sort of is portraying Jesus like Moses as well, which, another Old Testament figure.
That's another theme.
It's another theme. Yeah. So there's, as you unravel it, the more you look at it, the more that there is going on. And it's, I sort of sometimes think about this because you can sort of look at something like the book of Matthew and look at all these different themes and hear echoes back to other parts of the Bible and things like that. And sometimes I think, what's the point? What's the purpose of that? But it's the point of it is it's getting you to understand and meet this person, Jesus, more, isn't it? Because once you hear all those echoes and you hear all those claims that are being made, you can then see that, oh, okay, so he's like Moses, but he's better than Moses because of this. Oh, okay, he's he's got authority.
There's the link with David as well.
There's things of David we've talked about, and then the passage in Isaiah. He is that symbol. He's the proof that God is with us, with his people. And so let's think about that and what that means. And then ultimately, when you get right to the end, he says that he is with you. So the same sort of power that is with the people in the way that Jesus taught and preached and gave his life and then was raised from the dead. That's something that can be with us to then keep us going. That's beyond Matthew, but that's they help us understand him better. We're about discovering Jesus. Paying attention to all these structural things in the book, they really help us to understand him better than just simply sort of just reading and thinking that was a nice thing that he said, that kind of thing.
Wonderful. Good stuff. Right. I'm just mindful that we don't want to eat all the material that we're going to use in other episodes. So maybe you can give us a bit of a trailer into what's happening in the next episode, what we're going to look at next.
Yeah. So what I think we need to do next, we've thought about the start. So the origins, the family tree, the connection back to the Old Testament. We've thought about a lot of conceptual ideas this episode. We've thought about structure and themes and things like that. What we need to do is just wind back a little bit and spend a bit of time parked in chapter 4 of Matthew. So there's a passage there that talks about Jesus going into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. So I think it's really, it's
going to get heavy.
It's a great narrative. And you read it and you could scratch your head and think, what's going on there? It's really, it's meaty. It's good. It's brilliant. It's a fascinating narrative. Again, lots of things you can come at it maybe with a lot of assumptions. I'm going to try and not have those assumptions or any assumptions, and we'll just we'll tackle it at face value and what in the context of what Matthew's already said. Jesus and the devil next
Excellent.
time.
It should be called Approaching Matthew with No Assumptions. That should be the name of the series.
Okay, we could rename it. If you like.
Let's not go that far. Okay, well, thank you, Dan, for what you've just taken us through. It's been really interesting. Once again, fascinating study into this important gospel record. I'm sure we've all come away with some additional thoughts and musings on that topic. Thank you for listening, and please go to our website, biblefeed.org. Also, you can follow us on Facebook as well. Please join the conversation as well. Get in touch. Send us messages on the website or on Facebook. Leave a review as well. We're always interested in feedback and discussion on the interesting things that we've been talking about. So, thank you very much, Dan, and until next time.
Yeah, thank you, Laurence.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think and hear your questions on subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send us a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.